Most people think they know who the loudest voices of American history were: politicians, generals, presidents. But sometimes the most earth-shaking voices come from those the world tried hardest to silence. Sojourner Truth was born without freedom, without rights, and without even her own name. Yet she grew into a woman who stood before presidents and demanded justice. She had no formal education, no wealth, and no powerful family. What she had was her voice, and with it, she reshaped the very meaning of freedom in America. This is not just the story of a woman, it's the story of truth itself, rising from chains, refusing silence, and demanding the world listen. She was born Isabella Baumfree around 1797 in Ulster County, New York. The exact date is lost. Slaves' births were not worth recording in ledgers. She was one of 13 children, most sold away before she was old enough to remember their faces. Her first memories were not of toys or lullabies, but of being sold like livestock. At 9 years old, she was auctioned off with a flock of sheep for just $100. She was passed from one master to another, each cruel in their own way. She was beaten for not understanding English, punished for questions she couldn't answer. But even in this brutality, Isabella had something most could not take from her: an iron will. She prayed, she listened, she remembered. Somewhere deep inside, a voice was growing. As a young woman, Isabella fell in love with a fellow enslaved man named Robert. But love, too, was not hers to choose. Her master forced her into another marriage, one that fit his economic interests. With her husband Thomas, she bore children who, like herself, were considered property. The cruelest wound came when her young son Peter was illegally sold into slavery in Alabama. She had no rights as a mother, no legal claim, but she did the unthinkable. She went to court, and she won. Isabella became one of the first black women to challenge a white man in court and win custody of her child. It was a small victory in a system stacked against her, but it revealed something vital. Her voice had power. In 1826, Isabella made a decision that would change everything. Carrying her infant daughter Sophia, she walked away from her master's farm. She had no plan, no resources, only faith that God would guide her steps. She found refuge with a Quaker family, the Van Wageners, who paid her former master $20 to secure her freedom legally. It was here she began to glimpse what life outside bondage could look like. She soon moved to New York City, where she worked as a domestic servant. But the city was no safe haven. She faced poverty, exploitation, and the constant weight of racism. Still, she was free. And freedom was a seed she would plant everywhere she went. In 1843, Isabella experienced what she described as a divine calling. God had given her a mission: to travel, to preach, and to speak the truth. She shed the name Isabella Baumfree and became Sojourner Truth. Sojourner, because she would journey through the land. Truth, because that was all she intended to speak. From then on, she roamed from town to town, delivering fiery sermons that combined her deep Christian faith with her demand for justice. She spoke about abolition, women's rights, poverty, and morality. People who had never heard a woman, much less a black woman, speak in public were astonished. She was tall, commanding, and fearless. Her words cut through prejudice like a blade. She could move audiences to tears, then laughter, then silence. In 1851, Sojourner attended the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. The room was thick with tension. Some women fought for suffrage, but dismissed black women as too radical. Some men mocked the entire gathering. When Sojourner rose to speak, the room stilled. Her voice carried across the hall. "Ain't I a woman?" She reminded them that she had plowed fields, planted crops, borne children, endured lashes, and still she stood. If women were to be excluded from rights because they were seen as weak, then what of her? Though the exact words have been debated over time, the power of that moment remains. She shattered the false divide between race and gender with one piercing question. By the mid-1840s, Sojourner Truth was walking roads that once carried chains and now carried her voice. Her mission had just begun. What she said next would change the course of women's rights, abolition, and America itself. The 1840s were a boiling cauldron. Across America, the abolitionist movement was gaining strength. Newspapers printed stories of escapes, rebellions, and the brutality of plantations. White reformers like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass were demanding an end to slavery. But while most abolitionists were men with newspapers or pulpits, Sojourner brought something none of them could: lived experience, wrapped in a sermon that pierced the soul. She told audiences exactly what it meant to be enslaved, not as an abstract concept, but as a living nightmare. She painted images of children ripped from their mothers, of whips cracking across backs, of faith clung to when all else was stripped away. She made it impossible to look away. Some in the movement doubted her at first. She was uneducated, couldn't read or write, but she didn't need books, she was the testimony. And soon, Sojourner was traveling from city to city, becoming one of the most commanding voices for freedom. But Sojourner saw something else too. While she was fighting for the abolition of slavery, another movement was rising: the fight for women's rights. In 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention made headlines as white women demanded the vote and equal treatment. Yet in those meetings, there was often silence around black women. White suffragists talked about equality, but their vision was sometimes limited: freedom for them, not necessarily for all. Sojourner walked into that tension like a storm. She knew that her fight wasn't only against slavery. It was against the very idea that women, especially black women, were less than men, and she would not let anyone ignore it. The defining moment came in 1851 at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. Picture the room, filled with suffragists, reformers, skeptics. Men in the audience shouted insults, heckling the speakers. Some women faltered, their voices drowned out. Then Sojourner Truth rose to speak. She was tall, commanding, with the weight of history in her presence. The hecklers went silent, and in that silence, she delivered one of the most legendary speeches in American history. Her words were not polished rhetoric, they were raw, unshakable truth. That man over there says women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery, and when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? The speech electrified the room. It was more than words, it was a mirror, forcing America to see its contradictions. If women deserved equality, then surely black women, who had endured the very worst, deserved it too. The refrain, "Ain't I a woman?" became more than a question. It became a rallying cry. But speaking truth came with danger. At events, Sojourner was often heckled, threatened, even physically attacked. Once, a man accused her of being a man disguised as a woman because he could not believe a woman could be so powerful. Without hesitation, she bared her breast to the audience and declared, "Ain't I a woman?" The crowd erupted in shock. She turned their insult into proof. Another time, angry mobs threatened her life for speaking against slavery. She stood her ground, unflinching. For Sojourner, fear was irrelevant. She believed her mission came from God, and no earthly threat could silence her. Through the 1850s and into the Civil War era, Sojourner Truth's influence only grew. She wasn't just fighting for one cause, she was weaving them together: abolition, women's rights, human dignity. She met with leading figures of her day: Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Susan B. Anthony. With Douglass, she once clashed. He argued that violence might be necessary to end slavery. Sojourner, with unwavering calm, replied, "Is God dead?" reminding him that faith could still move mountains. Her perspective wasn't always popular, but it was always unshakable. By the time the nation marched toward civil war, Sojourner Truth had already declared war on the lies holding it together. She had spoken into churches, town halls, and convention halls. She had turned her pain into a weapon more powerful than chains or guns: her truth. But her journey was far from over. The war would open new doors and new battles, and Sojourner, now an unstoppable force, would walk through them with the same unbreakable fire. By 1861, America was tearing itself apart. The Civil War had begun, and the question of slavery, once a political debate, was now a battlefield reality. For Sojourner Truth, this was no abstract conflict. It was the reckoning she had always known would come. While others fled from the chaos of war, she stepped toward it. She saw the war as divine judgment, a cleansing fire meant to burn away the sin of slavery. But she also knew freedom would not be handed down without struggle. Sojourner did not wield a musket or march in uniform, but her battlefield was just as vital, the human spirit. She threw herself into recruiting black men to join the Union Army, traveling from camp to camp, rallying former slaves and free black men alike. Imagine her voice echoing through a crowded square. "Brothers, this is your time. Take up arms, fight for the freedom you deserve, and prove to the world that we are as brave and capable as any." Her presence was electric. Men who had once been denied even the right to their own bodies now stood ready to fight for the freedom of millions. Sojourner understood something many did not. Freedom without participation was fragile. For freedom to be real, the enslaved had to be part of their own liberation. In 1864, Sojourner Truth walked into the White House. A woman who had once been sold for $100 now sat across from President Abraham Lincoln himself. Lincoln had just issued the Emancipation Proclamation the year before, and the war was raging. Sojourner had come to advocate for the rights of freed people, particularly the chance to build lives beyond chains, land, jobs, education. Lincoln greeted her with respect, even standing to shake her hand. He told her he had read about her in the newspapers. She, in turn, told him that God had placed him in the presidency for this very purpose, to end slavery. The moment was symbolic, almost cinematic. The President of the United States listening to a woman who had once been enslaved, her very presence proof of how far truth could travel. But freedom was complicated. After the war, millions of freed men and freed women faced a brutal reality. They were technically free, but left with nothing. No land, no compensation, no protection. Sojourner threw herself into this new battlefield. She worked with the Freedmen's Bureau, advocating for former slaves to receive land grants. She argued that without economic independence, freedom would be hollow. "Slavery is dead," she declared, "but the spirit that lived in it is not dead." She also campaigned for education, believing it was the true weapon of liberation. In community meetings, churches, and public squares, she demanded schools for black children and opportunities for women to learn trades and professions. Even as she fought for the rights of freed people, Sojourner never abandoned the women's rights cause. But here, too, she found tension. After the war, the nation debated who should receive the vote first, black men or women. Many white suffragists argued that if black men gained the vote before white women, it would be a disaster. Some even revealed ugly racist views, claiming educated white women should not be placed beneath uneducated freedmen. Sojourner stood in the storm of this division. For her, the answer was clear. Both, black men and women. White women too, everyone deserved the vote. She refused to pit race against gender, because she lived at the crossroads of both. She traveled tirelessly, speaking on behalf of universal suffrage, reminding audiences that equality was indivisible. If colored men get their rights, and not colored women theirs, you see the colored men will be masters over the women, and it will be just as bad as it was before. As she aged, Sojourner never slowed. Into her 70s and 80s, she was still traveling, still speaking. Her body bore the marks of slavery, but her spirit remained unbroken. In 1872, she even tried to vote in a presidential election in Michigan, decades before women had the legal right. She was turned away, of course, but her act was symbolic. She was staking a claim for generations yet to come. Her speeches continued to mesmerize audiences. She spoke less of her own suffering and more of hope, of the vision of a just America. Yet always, she carried the sharp edge of truth. She refused to flatter, refused to soften her message. Justice was not something to be begged for. It was something to be demanded. Sojourner Truth's life defies summary. She was born into slavery and died a national icon. She carried scars but turned them into sermons. She had no wealth, no formal education, but her words shook presidents, suffragists, and citizens alike. Her legacy is not just in the history books, But in every march for justice, every demand for equality, every woman who refuses to be silenced, every man who believes freedom must belong to all, the refrain she thundered in Akron still echoes, "Ain't I a woman?" It is more than a question. It is a challenge. It is a reminder. It is an anthem that still burns, reminding us that the measure of justice is not in words, but in who is included when those words are spoken. Picture her once more, a tall, commanding woman with a voice like thunder, standing before a crowd that could not look away. Her life was proof that truth itself, once spoken, cannot be chained. Sojourner Truth, a name, a voice, a legacy. Not just a woman of history, but a woman who rewrote history.